Good afternoon. I'm Matthew McCabe, and I'm reporting to you from Syracuse, New York. Last week, the Federal Bureau of Prisons released its latest data on prison inmates. Many viewers were shocked to learn the language of drug offenders currently in prison. As you can see, we have drug offenses at 46.2%, robbery at a total of 3.7%, homicide, assault, and kidnapping at 3.3%, burglary and larceny at 4.7%, weapons, arson, and explosives at 17.4%, and sex offenses at 9.4%. With drug offenses making up almost half of our federal prisons, it makes you wonder how we got to this point. We're going to switch over to reporter Carrie Goodian for give us some insight on the war on drugs, as well as some solutions. Carrie, over to you.
Good afternoon, Matthew. For the last decade, the war on drugs has been prevalent all across the country, taking drug dealers and users with it. The war on drugs ranges widely from the criminalization of drugs, authorities targeting specific demographics, the lack of mobility in the United States, minimal treatment facilities, addiction being considered a crime, and so much more. I'd like to focus specifically on the issue of drug offenders being sentenced to prison rather than being sent to rehabilitation centers. Let's take a closer look at a study that was published in the SAGE journals called 5-Year Outcomes of Therapeutic Community Treatment of Drug-Involved Offenders After Release from Prison. In this scholarly article, the authors found that the criminalization of drugs has, historically, been presented as an emergency response to an imminent threat rather than evidence-based health or social policy intervention. As a response, these authors aim to inform their audience about the therapeutic communities and how they offer a more successful method of rehabilitation, proving their communities are successful, pointing out the extensive research. Let's take a look at a graph published in the SAGE journals. Looking at this graph, you can see that those who complete the programs are more likely to be drug-free than those who didn't get treatment. Their data published contains specifics in regards to demographics, past criminal history, and history of drug abuse, which overall proved their method of treatment to be effective. Again, the U.S. needs to be looking at drug addiction as a disease rather than a criminal act. In similar news, this past week, activists gathered at the Met in the wing donated by the Sackler family, who is responsible for the mass production of oxycodone. Many activists were people who eventually became addicted to the drug after being prescribed. Here's a short clip.
Thousands are dying every day. 130 people dying in this country, and they're moving their businesses to Europe. They're going to kill people there. Their lies, telling everyone that this medication was not harmful. They knew the stats. They knew the stats. They said 1% got addicted. In their study, 13% got addicted. They're responsible for the epidemic. So now they're responsible for all these deaths and responsible to get the addicts, to help the addicts get off medication.
It is clear that people want reform on our current laws regarding drugs, and it is up to us to prompt the change we want to see. In addition to protests being held by activists, they've taken their stands to social media platforms. Let's take a closer look at some tweets on Twitter. The tweet on the left shows the bias and racial profiling made by policemen towards certain neighborhoods. In support of his argument, the police states that they gravitate towards those neighborhoods because they receive the most calls to the area, when in reality their 911 logs show otherwise. The tweet on the right is actually comical in that Trump wants to give the death penalty to drug offenders. So should people with other various forms of disease receive the death penalty as well? Mr. President, I'd love some supporting evidence that proves that the death penalty is more effective for drug addicts than rehabilitation. My colleague Stephen will further discuss alternatives to rehabilitation and the war on drugs. Before he speaks, I wanted to briefly touch up on what laws are currently enforced for cocaine. In the picture, you can see that there's 10 milligrams, 30 milligrams, and 50 milligrams. Both 10 and 30 milligrams can result in a minimum of 5 years in prison, and 50 milligrams can result in a minimum sentencing of 10 years. Now, over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Carrie. Going back to how the US should go about the war on drugs, we decided to take a closer look at how other countries are approaching it. In a publication found in the British Medical Journal, the author presents a different solution to combating the war on drugs. The author of this article describes that by having government involvement in regulating the drug market, this would prevent dangerous drugs being circulated around criminal areas. By doing so, the government is able to regulate the market however it sees necessary. We're shown that the methods and materials used to change is through the observation of current problems of prohibition and emerging changes. In conclusion, rather than make drugs illegal, it's been proven that legalizing and decriminalizing drug users to be a much safer method to winning the war on drugs, in addition to implementing rehabilitation for drug offenders. We're shown that this is the best way to combat the war on drugs, and in doing so, it decreases the casualties and overdose usages among users. The United States has been combating the war on drugs with tremendous police interventions. However, it's clear that this method on the war on drugs has been ineffective. Ultimately, our best alternative to the war on drugs is to start legalizing drugs and decriminalize those that are in possession. Lastly, we head back to Matthew where he will be talking about why the war on drugs has been so ineffective. Now, over to you, Matthew.
You see the different approaches from other countries, and you'd think that by now we would have followed in their footsteps, being that we have the highest incarceration rates. Just to give you some insight as to the world incarceration rates, here's a graph from prisonstudies.org. As you can see, the U.S. comes in number 1 with 2,145,000 people imprisoned, followed by the United Kingdom, who ranks in at number 19, with 84,235 people incarcerated. There's a pretty drastic difference between the UK and US prison population total, which is just a little over 2 million people, so maybe we could learn a thing or two from them. In a TED Talk given by Ethan Nadelman, he vouched for a different approach to the war on drugs. One of the major problems that Nadelman sees with the status quo is the treatment of drug users. As Carrie found, the current prison system has been ineffective, and instead, the U.S. should work on providing care and rehabilitation centers for addicts. Nadelman agrees with this, but also adds by arguing that drug use in society has always and will always be present in society.
There's probably never been a drug-free society. Virtually every society has ingested psychoactive substances to deal with pain, increase our energy, socialize, even commune with God. Right? Our desire to alter our consciousness may be as fundamental as our desires for food, companionship, and sex. So our true challenge is to learn how to live with drugs so they cause the least possible harm and, in some cases, the greatest possible benefit.
With an internet demand coming from the people of the U.S., cartels all over the world compete for the market. So even if one goes down, another will surely pop up and be able to fill the demand, making it practically impossible for the U.S. to ever stop the supply or demand.
Security clearance, I interviewed hundreds of DEA and other law enforcement agents all around Europe and the Americas, and I'd ask them, what do you think the answer is? Well, in Latin America, they'd say to me, you can't really cut off the supply. The answer lies back in the U.S. in cutting off the demand. So then I go back home and I talk to people involved in anti-drug efforts there, and they'd say, Ethan, you can't really cut off the demand. Answer lies over there. You got to cut off the supply. Then I go and talk to the guys in customs trying to stop drugs at the borders, and they say, you're not going to stop it here. The answer lies over there in cutting off supply and demand. And it hit me. Everybody involved in this thought the answer lay in that area about which they knew the least.
Looking at previous research, we can see that other countries who have began to legalize drugs have helped to eliminate all profits that can go to their cartel, which is their main source of revenue, and in turn ensures for safer drug consumption and the ability to apply a tax to drugs. These profits could be reinvested into the care, rehabilitation, and education for the people of the U.S.
As for the other drugs, look at Portugal, where nobody goes to jail for possessing drugs, and the government's made a serious commitment to treating addiction as a health issue. Look at Switzerland, Germany, Netherlands, Denmark, England, where people who've been addicted to heroin for many years and repeatedly tried to quit and failed can get pharmaceutical heroin and helping services in medical clinics. And the results are in. Illegal drug abuse and disease and overdoses and crime and arrests all go down, health and well-being improve, taxpayers benefit, and many drug users even put their addictions behind them.
We hope you learned a few things about the war on drugs and what we can do to change our country's outlook on this issue. Today we covered how to properly treat addicts, other countries' solutions to the war on drugs, and the effectiveness of it all. And why do we need to stop the war on drugs to prevent it from continuing for another decade? Thank you for watching.